Recording now?
Yes, it says.
Yeah,
recording.
okay. Now we'll turn to this. All right. Thank you all for coming to this lunch talk. I will introduce our speaker, Relli Shechter, in a second. But first, I want to thank the Department of History, the Department of Political Science, the Humanities Institute, and the Center for Global Studies for supporting this talk. Please sign in on this sheet at the entrance if you haven't. I want to remind that we have another talk. The next talk in our Middle East Studies lecture series is on October 17th. We have Murat Yildiz from Skidmore College talking about serious fun. We have another talk scheduled for November 3rd for updates on the events and more information on what we do. Follow us on the various platforms of social media, and this talk, like previous talks and future talks, will be on our YouTube channel, the History Department. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today Relli Shechter. Hi, Art. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today Relli Shechter. He is the chair of the Department of Middle East Studies at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. He graduated a graduate of Tel Aviv University, where he earned his BA degree, magna cum laude, in Middle East and African history. Shechter has completed an advanced level course in Arabic language in Middlebury College. He holds a PhD in history and Middle East studies from Harvard. Shechter's recent book, The Rise of the Egyptian Middle Class, Socioeconomic Mobility and Public Discontent from Nasser to Sadat, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2018, and a new book, The Egyptian Social Contract, A History of State Middle Class Relations, is forthcoming with Edinburgh University Press. And also, Relli was one of my master thesis advisors, so it's a double pleasure. So please join me in welcoming Relli Shechter.
Thanks for coming. Apologies in advance. I didn't know who and how many people are going to be in the audience, so I prepared I'm going to read my lecture, although it's a small audience. But feel free to stop me whenever anything is unclear or you want to ask questions. I can stop, talk for a while, and then I can go back to the lecture. So we have the benefits of a small audience in that sense, and feel free to use the opportunity. The talk today is part of a forthcoming book, as we all mentioned, and we all thank you so much, and of course all the institutional settings involved in taking care of me and inviting to this presentation, to this lecture earlier on. It's a pleasure to be here. I knew very little about the university and the campus before coming here, but Lior took me into a very high intensive course on life, or university and life in university city, such as
State College.
State College. It's really fascinating and it's exciting. I've lived in the US previously for 5 years, but it's really totally different experience. Also, like a total immersion in this environment, which is new and fascinating for me, and my family is also accompanying me, and they will be very so. Thank you, of course, and the family.
Oh, pleasure.
The talk today is part of a forthcoming book that discusses the long-term history of the social contract in Egypt between 1922 and 2011. This is between semi-independence in Egypt and the Arab uprising. The talk focuses on this social contract as an explicit and implicit agreement between the state and a rising middle class. What you see in the slide above is the cover of the National Charter, often considered a new social contract in Egypt of the early 1960s, an assumption that I will critically revisit in my presentation today.
So what is the assumption that you will revisit just so
that this national charter actually embodies social contracts in Egypt, or it's an explicit agreement between state and society. Not that it, let me put my thesis forward. Not that it wasn't. I'm critical of the public and now historical perception of this document. Okay. The talk focuses on a formulating era in Egypt's modern history. The 1952 Three Officers Revolution, a military coup that will lead to the establishment of President Gamal Abdel Nasser in power. This revolution still carries a legacy in Egypt. The military regime that took charge back then is still with us 70 years later. This is one reason that makes the social contract established during this period worth exploring. A second and the main reason for this lecture is to say something about authoritarianism. We often associate authoritarianism with the top-down politics and state repression against the opposition. This is no doubt true. What often goes missing in such analysis is society-state interactions. Who in societies provides support for autocratic regimes and why? This question is at the core of my presentation today. Most of the academic literature refers to state-citizen relations under President Nasser as a new authoritarian bargain or exchange of state protection and provision of public goods in return for citizens' lack of participation in state decision-making. When I'm saying academic literature, I mostly mean political science that has recently begun to study the notion of social contracts in Egypt and in the Middle East more broadly. This is my broad frame of reference. Put differently, under this authoritarian bargain, citizens gave up political rights for economic rights. However, this top-bottom approach to politics does not leave much space to social agency in politics, or how social support facilitated the 1952 revolution and the decolonial process that followed Egypt's full independence. I explore Nasser's rise to power as a social revolution, at the center of which was Egypt's expanded middle class, known in Arabic as the Effendi. I use the term Effendi middle class when discussing this group as both a state creation and as a creation of the as a creator, of the Nasserite state. In my analysis, the revolution, more accurately, evolution, did not simply begin on July 23rd, 1952, the day when it formally started. Rather, it had its origin in the mid-1930s. This revolution rose to the establishment of an authoritarian regime, a regime that replaced a semi-democratic liberal monarchy in Egypt. However, for many who supported Nasser, it represented a hope for greater influence on state decision-making than in the past, and experience and expectations for fast socioeconomic development. Therefore, personal and social liberation, as well as political independence from Britain. I discussed Nasser's state as an Effendi state, a state implicitly captured by the Effendi middle class, and one that implemented this class's vision and interests. In much of the research literature or public discourse in Egypt, this is little acknowledged. Scholarship often refers to the fact that the middle class, past and present, has been the main constituency of the Egyptian state. But such scholarship hardly explains why and how. The social origins of Nasser's regime are little studied. Yes, again, this is at the core of my research project. Starting during the mid-1930s, Egypt experienced a gradual process of decolonization, bringing to more political say for Egyptians in managing the state, especially in matters of local economic and social policy. This process was temporarily brought to a halt during World War II, when the British abruptly retook power by force. However, after the war, the call for full independence from the British returned to central stage in Egypt. The demand for independence did not stop at the political. Economic nationalism became a second central call that included a demand for economic independence, but also the call for rapid economic development, and especially through industrialization. Full national liberation will not come, Egyptians argue, till the emerging nation state turned economically as well as politically free of foreign domination. The call for independence also carried a search for personal and social liberation that would rejuvenate that of the nation. Lastly, the demand for national independence was further a call for cultural freedom, or liberating the local culture from Western cultural dominance, including through the making of a new national culture. For some, cultural liberation meant embodying Islam in the state. The demand for liberation, freedom, and independence was broad and inclusive of all spheres of life, as well as in political arena. Again, this is crucial because, as I'm suggesting here, we're talking about a social revolution, not only a political one that will make each independence politically from the region. In the description above, I presented the expectations from decolonization as universal, or as shared by the entire national movement, therefore by all Egyptians. This was indeed the way that these expectations were presented in the contemporary public discourse, for example, in the Egyptian press. Nevertheless, central to my argument today, such expectations were far from being universal or represented those of the entire society. Rather, they centered on a vision and interests of one central class in society more than that of other classes, those of the rising Effendi middle class. This class, whose representative dominated public and political discourse in Egypt, turned the spokesperson of the national movement. Its self-image, worldview, and vision of independent Egypt dominated those of the nation. Other social classes participated in the national movement that fought for independence, but their voice in shaping Egypt's future was limited. Important questions such as what decolonization would entail, how it was to be implemented, and crucially, who would benefit from it, were not equally discussed or agreed upon by the entire society. Instead, the Effendi middle class took central stage in shaping an emerging new post-colonial social contract between the independent nation state and society. A few words about the origins of the Effendi middle class. This class was foremost the result of a state-making process, the creation of a modernizing state in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, more broadly, and since the early 19th century. By state creation, I mean that this new class largely emerged from state search for administrators, educators, military and police officers, lawyers, engineers, and medical professionals for employment in the expanding state bureaucracy and the army. Moreover, the state facilitated the making of such new cadres by sending Egyptian students abroad and later establishing state institutions of modern learning in Egypt. At the risk of oversimplification, state centrality in the making of the Effendi middle class was quite different than the market-oriented based establishment of new middle classes or bourgeoisie, as happened, for example, in some parts of Western Europe. Since 1882, the British occupation of Egypt threatened social mobility into the Effendi middle class, and for two reasons. First, the British occupation introduced a restraining fiscal policy in the state budget, including through reducing state employment. Second, the British often discriminated against Egyptians in state service through an informal hiring policy that preferred the appointment of Europeans and local minorities and compensated them better. As a result of this and other reasons, and of course the national movement is winning wider than that. So for the sake of argument, the Effendi middle class soon turned the leading social power in the emerging Egyptian national movement, calling for independence that would reverse this situation. After World War I, a semi-independent state was established in Egypt. The British still dominated Egypt's foreign affairs and played a significant backstage role in local politics. In 1923, however, Egypt became a liberal monarchy. Under the liberal monarchy, the state fast expanded elementary, but especially secondary and higher education. Moreover, the state began employing educated Egyptians in ever-growing numbers. The intertwined result of greater higher education and larger state employment brought to the expansion of the Effendi middle class. Since 1936, and in the aftermath of the new British-Egyptian agreement, education in military academies leading to military careers for the Effendi middle class was part of this overall narrative. It was from within this cohort of young Egyptian officers that the three officers led by Nasser emerged. Yeah. The caricature presented here in the slide, in this caricature, it's courtesy of my colleague Karen Sfadi, who actually worked very closely on caricature in the Egyptian press of the period. So this caricature is of Masr Effendi, translated Egyptian Effendi. Such caricatures started to appear in the Egyptian press during the late 1920s and became an iconic representation of this class during the 1930s, and not by accident, because it was during the 1930s that this class is expanding fast as a result of the changes within the Egyptian state that I described earlier. The caricature visualizes three aspects of the Effendi middle class during this period. First, this caricature exposes the Effendi middle class as modern yet authentic class. The Effendis in the caricature wore European suits, but also the tarbush or the local headgear, and they don Islamic prayer. I don't know if you can see this on the first row. You see this very clearly. They carry the Islamic prayer bead to represent this amalgam, of modernity and authenticity. Second, this caricature presents the Effendi middle class as an everyday Egyptian. Demographically, this class was still very small, perhaps around 10% of the entire population. The figures are kind of unclear for this period, but it was numerically small for sure. But this did not deter it from representing itself as embodying the nation. And third and related argument is that this caricature represents the Effendi middle class as both leading the following the national cause. Effendi is carrying the barrier, but also the rows of Effendis that follow him, and the national cause in this case is the struggle for full independence in the post-1936 agreement with the British. During the liberal monarchy, Egypt's economic and political elites, many of whom were large landlords, still dominated the state and benefited from such domination. Nevertheless, the offending middle class increasingly became the main constituency of the state. In addition to providing education and employment, the state shielded the offending middle class in times of economic hardships during the Great Depression of the 1930s and later during World War II. The plight of this class was a central socio-political concern within Egypt's parliamentary system and in the fast-growing arena of extra-parliamentary politics and activism. From the Muslim Brotherhood to liberal intellectuals, to the communists and the socialists. The overwhelming leadership and often core supporters of these groups came from among the offending middle class. And this is yet another core argument that I'm trying to make here. To try and see above or beyond the more immediate politics into a broad connection. And a class, again, vision interest beyond political division. The centrality of the offending middle class in society was further well demonstrated in the Egyptian press that reflected closely dialogue, with the above. In the press, an earlier call for social reform that focused on the alleviation of ignorance, poverty, and disease among poor peasants and workers was partly replaced by a new call for social justice that was to promote equality of opportunity and equity in Egypt, and implicitly so for the offending middle class. A genuine concern for the poor never fully disappeared from public discourse or state action. Nevertheless, analysis of state expenditures on various social services indicates a bias towards catering to the economic needs of the offending middle class over those of the lower classes, still the vast majority of Egyptians. And this, here I actually conducted a political economy analysis of state expenditure. I'm not going to go into that here, but what written, I mean, it's documented in the forthcoming book. This analysis demonstrated relatively more state funds dedicated to higher education in comparison to elementary education. A better quality of health services and physical infrastructure in cities as opposed to the, especially Cairo and Alexandria, as opposed to rural regions. Most important, a large portion of state budget went to expenditures on state employment, with such employment gradually turning an implicit state service for the middle class. The cost of such employment further reduced the ability of the state to help those most in need. And we are still talking about a period when we have an official economic policy, a liberal economic policy that pushes for restraint budget. Therefore, again, when we look at the statistics, it's quite mind-boggling how large a portion went to salaries and benefits as opposed to the actual services provided to citizens in Egypt. During the last turbulent years of the liberal monarchy, and despite a clear bias in state allocation in favor of the offending middle class, there was an increase in their opposition to the Egyptian government and the ruling elite that led it. Here I'm making a distinction between the government and the state. It is the state that there is a position. So it's the government that is going opposition against, but actually the state and the concept of what the state should do for its citizens is enlarging and becoming more and more consensual. Many demanded that the government should take a greater role in socioeconomic development as well as in bringing full independence to Egypt. These demands were the result of economic hardships such as increasing inflation and ensuing rising prices in the aftermath of World War II. They are also part of a growing regional and global demand to end the age of empire. This is the post-1945 era. Spokespersons of the offending middle class called for better leadership than the seemingly inapt leadership of the WAF party that headed recent governments in Egypt. They demanded state-led solutions in resolving Egypt's hardship, but expressed an increased mistrust in the ability of Egypt's liberal monarchy to do so. In the Egyptian public political discourse, there was a growing discontent with the government and the desire to see a stronger and well-managed state that would promote Egyptian red-defending interests. During this period, there was also a rise in rural unrest and labor protests in demand for better standards of living for the lower classes. For many within the Egyptian middle class, this further meant that the state should do more to alleviate poverty. However, many also feared social unrest and expected the government to restore stability even by using force if necessary. So it's kind of critique in the middle as opposed to the bottom up that we often contrast to the top bottom. That's my analysis is based on this kind of middle up perspective of things. When it happened, the 1952 Free Officers' Revolution was well received in Egypt. This revolution was led by military officers, but the revolution was not regarded as a simple military coup and a narrow attempt to capture power. Many hoped that the free officers would restore stability and facilitate future reforms, as well as introduce much required changes to Egypt's political system. Since 1952, and especially after 1954, when Nasser established his political dominance in Egypt, the revolutionary forces struggled to reshape Egyptian national memory. The revolution promoted a zero-hour narrative, according to which there was little continuity between the so-called old regime, that of the liberal monarchy, and that of the new Nasserite state. In this narrative, the revolution was seemingly a new beginning set against all past evils, from foreign occupation to socioeconomic failures to social cleavages in Egyptian society. The past centrality of the offending middle class in shaping Egypt's society and politics was downplayed. Indeed, the term effendi disappeared from daily use. And from here on, when I'm using it, I intentionally use it anachronistically, to make to bridge this seeming gap before and after Nasser. Internal scholarship further adopted this revolutionary narrative, often referred to new middle class or new men in Nasserite Egypt, with little mention of the Effendi origins. Surprisingly, such scholarship recognized the Effendi origins of Nasser and his generation of military officers, and I'm referring to Batikiotis' work here, but with little reference to such origins when discussing Nasser and his post-colonial project. As a result, the post-revolutionary state was associated with Nasser and Nasserism, with less attention to the social environment that shaped this state. I'm now going to screen a short video clip. In this video clip, we'll see President Nasser reading for 6 hours, although I'm not going to indulge you with all the 6 hours.
Only the first one.
The draft of the National Charter, the future formal social contract of the Nasserite state, and the one that I showed, the front of which I showed you earlier. This reading is taking place before the National Congress of Popular Forces. Members of the Congress were supposed to represent the entire Egyptian society, which they hardly did. The event symbolically took place in Cairo University, the bastion of the Effendi middle class. Most importantly, and as you watch the video clip, notice the clear top-down or leader-crowd dynamics embedded in the different shots. It was by such means of mass media, not simply writing or rewriting history books, that the iconic image of Nasser as a leader and Nasserism was shaped. If you can enlarge the screen first.
Yeah.
And, move or an official state event. This was a news brief. Cuts into the audience all the time. When he's reading the ambassadors from the entire world and others were present, also representative of the entire Egypt. President Sadat, vice president. The audience still made a concentrated effort to bring this part of society.
Women.
There will be. Good point, there will be. The forces. Next part, I think we have representation of women.
July?
Actually, it's May. We can stop here. We will not go on for my point is,
Such a calming voice.
if you could, what? My point is that this 0-hour narrative is thoroughly constructed by the Egyptian regime of the period. A brief examination, that is, of Egypt's political economy of the 1950s and the 1960s in comparison to what happened earlier under the liberal monarchy refutes the 0-hour narrative of Nasser's regime. Indeed, it sheds light on the centrality of the Effendi middle class in shaping the decolonization of Egypt. And again, I remind you that I refer to decolonization here quite unorthodoxly as starting in the mid-1930s, as opposed to 1952. Okay? Although I'm not the only one to do that, there is beginning to be a body of history writing.
The concept of tamsir is
That bridges on again the post and the pre and post eras. The Nasserite authoritarian state clearly carried the Effendi middle class's vision and interests into the institutions of the independent state and its politics, and the institutional arrangement and how they function is central interest to me. Notable example here was Egypt's turn to Arab socialism, seemingly the most significant transformation that Nasser took in reshaping the Egyptian economy, politics, and society. Arab socialism, while glorifying the Egyptian peasant and worker, was far from bringing a widespread socioeconomic transformation to rural regions. A land reform in Egypt one of the early and better known steps of the revolutionary regime, was already debated during the last days of the liberal monarchy. Moreover, the reform was significantly a political step in confiscating land from large landowners who were at the backbone of the economic and political elite of the old regime. Redistribution of such land to landless peasants was slow, and a rural middle class with strong ties to the offending middle class benefited mostly from it, as opposed to poor peasants. And again, I'm painting a black and white picture, but literature that is certainly.
But if I can just
Yeah.
clarify, when you talk about the offending middle class, you're referring to the class that was employed by the state, or is it wider than that? Because there was also private businesses and.
Yeah, it's always tricky to discuss middle class. There's much critique of this notion to begin with and put this list. I'm limiting my definition. It's mostly educated Egyptians, higher like secondary and then tertiary or university education, and state employees, and these two groups were actually closely intertwined together. And this is actually, if you look at the Egyptian middle class, the state employed middle class is, for historical reasons, which I can go into later if you want, it's much larger than the private sector middle class. It has something to do with the system of capitulation, the domination in the economy by oftentimes minorities and Europeans, which were advantage as a result of this system. It's not that there is no other middle class or middle classes, it's just that this is the dominant. And you also see the integration, because a son of a merchant, the merchant will send one of his sons to continue the business, the second son to get education and be employed by the states. The networks between the private and the public were very strong, so it would benefit the entire family to have an official, a bureaucrat in the family, perhaps a third son to go to the military academy. So the links are very close. And I specifically also referred to sons as opposed to daughters, because the vast majority of the majority that I discuss here is mostly male. Again, it's not my discovery. If you refer to the work of Lucy Zova, it's very obvious that at this stage, but also well into the Nasserite era, when state feminism was supposed to be the dominant and dominate. The vast majority of what we could refer to as offending middle class is still men. The main revolution will actually come after the 1970s, again for reasons that we can talk about later if you want. I was talking about the land reform. Egypt's model of state-led industrialization, or import substitute industrialization in economists speak, was to provide average quote-unquote Egyptians with commodities previously often imported from abroad and therefore expensive. It mostly catered to the rising middle class in providing it with cheaper consumer goods, therefore the much promised fruits of the revolution, a prevalent political promise at that time. Meanwhile, the states squeezed the agricultural sector in an effort to finance such industrialization. In Nasser's Egypt, state welfare services were expanded, but they kept the familiar biases of the past. Such biases included large state expenditures on education, but relatively more on higher education than on elementary education. This is almost mind-boggling when you see still a very high illiterate percentage of potential during this period. Health services and physical infrastructure remained more prevalent in cities as opposed to rural regions. Most notable was the rise in state employment of educated Egyptians. The state significantly increased employment in the civil service. In the newly established public sector, the state the state-sponsored economic sector, workers enjoyed much better wages and benefits than in the private sector. Furthermore, state employees, both civil servants and labor in state enterprises, received more and better quality state services and better state subsidies than other citizens and ones provided through their workplace. Arab socialism in Nasser's Egypt constituted the heyday of the offending middle class. Its fast rise as opposed to its disappearance. Education leading to state employment now allowed social mobility of poorer urbanites into this middle class. Middling peasants in rural regions and the aristocracy of public sector labor further joined in and constituted Egypt's rising middle class society of the time. An Effendi state class bias in economic and social development tracked this socioeconomic mobility in Egypt. Such mobility now became increasingly dependent on the state. The vast private sector, small peasants, laborers, and owners of small and medium enterprises was largely left to fend for itself. As it turned out, and for reasons beyond the scope of this lecture today, the rise of state-sponsored middle-class society was not sustainable for long. Indeed, the expansion of the offending middle class and its vision of development in Nasserite Egypt brought to a growing impoverishment among this class, especially since the second part of the 1960s, when Egypt's hope for fast socioeconomic growth began to wane. Regardless, by then, this model of socioeconomic development became part of Egypt's moral economy and a state commitment to its citizens that will be hard to share. And from here, I, in a sense, go from past to present. Conclusion. In Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world, Nasser's legacy is still much violent. Many acknowledge his regime as being authoritarian and repressive, and especially known is Nasser's repression of former acolytes turned political rivals, the communists, the socialists, but also the Muslim brothers. Nevertheless, he is revered for the fast-paced socioeconomic reform that he implemented, as well as for his regional and international achievements. At least until the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, this regime realized the hope of many among Egypt's emerging state-sponsored and state-dependent middle-class society. To the extent that Nasser's Effendi state was successful in tracking social mobility along middle-class lines, it will be hard for the state to bring liberal, later neoliberal economic reforms to Egypt. Such reform required a large change in its social contract, and in many ways, its reversal, notably in reducing state employment and state services, including subsidies to the middle class. The economic and social price that the Egyptian middle class will have to pay stalled such reforms for many decades, since the beginning of the 1970s, because Egypt's authoritarian rulers were keenly aware of the political risks associated with implementing. And here again, social agency, but perhaps in reverse. That is not how one promotes a new kind of state, but how social pressure and politics involved in such pressure influence decision-making in the world. President Sisi's recent return to such reforms is taking place under much state repression against this opposition precisely for this reason. Finally, a political change can take place in Egypt and in the Middle East more broadly only when new social force is formed to challenge the government, as the offending middle class did in a different historical context. during the 2010-2011 uprisings, a coalition of discontent calling for a comprehensive change in the political system was indeed temporarily formed. However, this coalition was not strong enough to overcome internal divisions over issues such as the required social reforms or the place of religion in society and the state. Until a new social coalition regroups, it is hard to see authoritarianism ending in the coming of democracy to the Middle East. Put simply, any future political change is depending on an earlier social transformation that would support it. Lior and I just had a brief talk on recent events in Iran, and this essentially what kind of forms my thinking about contemporary politics as well. We can also think together perhaps about how historians or what historians should do or not do in talking about the present. I know that this is a contested issue, especially among the historians, and I'm happy to engage in such a discussion. In any case, thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to questions.
So we can take questions now.
I have a question. Thanks. I'm Alex. Thank you for your talk. I'm historian adjacent, so I think I can talk about the present. Although my question is more about the past. I'm wondering to what extent you think formations like the United Arab Republic make studying the Egyptian state alone outside of an Arab regional context fraught or difficult. And was the UAR important to the political economic history that you are relating?
Yeah. These are actually two questions and great questions, because you're right. I mean, in my own work as well, you cannot write, you can no longer write a history of one place. Egypt, without bringing into account the regional and the global context. I perhaps oversimplified here because I wanted to make a concise argument about the middle class. The middle class itself, the Israeli middle class, is a regional phenomenon rather than the local Egyptian one, and it should be studied and understood. In this case, the UAR and the so-called Arab Cold War, the UAR, the United Arab Republic, for those who are less familiar, it's a short-lived union between Egypt and Syria that lasted about 3 years. The rivalry between Nasserism and Baathism all fall very strongly into, or should find themselves, finding stronghold in the overall narrative should be considered. As an author, I'm still struggling how to bring the local and the regional and global together, especially in this kind of a semi-public lecture. But I certainly think before.
My name is Arthur Goldschmidt.
We actually met 2 years ago in one of the Mesa meetings. We had a brief elevator talk, so I definitely remember your face.
Yes, I had forgotten about this talk until about 11:45 when I started. I was going to have quite a time explaining to my wife why I didn't show up for lunch. We lived through a good deal of this. I was a graduate student in Egypt from 1962 to 64. I also worked for a doctor at Harvard. One of the people who certainly had a lot of influence over me was Meir Safwan's father, the Dov Safwan, who was teaching. It seemed to me that Nasser didn't have much of an ideology himself. In fact, I think in the early days of the military coups that we've never seen, people just assumed that the officers wouldn't stay in power very long, that they would hand things over to some kind of a civilian government. And of course, there were already reforms in the last days of particularly when the Waqf was in power. I think in the rural social centers of Hussein is an example, which I'm afraid kind of died on the vine. We didn't hear much about them when I was living in Egypt. No, a great deal of emphasis would be put on things like the high dam, the industrialization of the country, the taking over of foreign-owned, or in some cases, Egyptian capitalist-owned concerns. I think the Misr company, for example, Misr Corporation. I think most of us came with a rather exaggerated notion of what the Egyptian state would actually do for the people and for the nation. I don't remember Egyptians taking the politics of other Arab countries that seriously. And I remember when we were all exposed to hoopla of a possible union of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq in 1960. Early 1964 was it earlier than that? I can't remember. There was supposed to be a revival of the United Arab Republic, but it briefly had a 3-star flag. I remember I got on a bus and the little kid asked me to say often, what is your nationality? And I said, what is your nationality? They'd always say Muslim in the Arabic. And everybody would start laughing because, of course, this is what we were supposed to say. But it wasn't what people really felt.
The ideology thing. This is a very strong theme in the literature. The argument that Nasser and his colleagues, when the federal officer, when they first came to power, have no ideology or no sense of what they're trying to establish. I go very forcefully in this. In my work, yes, they did not have full-fledged notion of the early 1960s, but when you take the reforms as you suggested, and when you look at the development of socialism, for example, in Egypt, earlier before the Arab officers, the connections are so strongly there that even if we do not have a strong ideology that is 1 to 10 points of this ideology, there was a very wide consensus on what the state should do, what should be done first. Second, a very large, broad consensus on focus on the state as the only vehicle to bring about these changes. Third, reforms already started earlier. Thoughts about the high dam. There was earlier. There was an early establishment of them at the beginning of the 20th century. So, without reading too much of Nasserism back in time, we can also not ignore the impact that this wide consensus had in formulating Nasser and people around him and the notion of state socialism. It's been used very frequently in the 1930s, especially after World War II. From here to Arab socialism, the distance, you cannot really imagine Arab socialism without this precedent. This is not to take away everything from Nasserism, just that establish Nasserism strongly on what happened before, and again establish it not only on the leader or the ruling elite of the Nasserite era, but on a broader consensual hegemonic or broader hegemony of the period in Gramscian sense. For that matter, how broad this hegemony was is debatable, but certainly overarching agreement, at least as far as I'm concerned, among the Egyptian Effendi middle class was there for sure.
I have do you want to? I have in a way very basic question. You're talking about the social contract. Can you briefly discuss the different appearances, the history of the different appearances of the term social contract in in Egypt, what can we learn from the recurring bringing up of this concept on the development of it?
So the social contract or Aqd Ijtimahi is first being debated in Egypt and throughout the world during the long 19th century, also called the age of constitutionalism, and it's part of the attempts to establish liberal states. In the Middle East, it's mostly some sort of liberal monarchy, what will be embodied later on in liberal monarchies under the mandate system of the post-World War I era. So it's part of local constitutionalism. The constitutive argument, constitutive document of the social contract will be newly established constitutions in Egypt, but also in Iraq, in Gulf, it was again broader kind of thing. The social contract of the period is the so-called liberal social contract, although it's been established and we're talking about post-World War I era and the interwar period. It's a liberal social contract established under imperial rule, so it had its very strong internal conflicts in the way it was actually performing, being implemented. Since in Egypt, since the mid-1930s, and especially after 1945, there's a strong sense that neither government nor the the formal document that is established in the 1923 Constitution was actually working, and a new intertwined call for two new principles to be established. First, social justice, and the second, of course, was independence in the fullest sense. For me, the interesting thing is the tradition of constitutions actually lingering on. So the National Charter is a kind of a document that was supposed to prepare the ground for a new constitution in Egypt, which is there is a draft of 1946 draft of the constitution, never formally voted upon and agreed upon, but it's still there. So even under authoritarian regime, you still have the certain principle of broader agreement. Perhaps one principle of democratic socialism as opposed to social democracy in other places. But certainly a social contract is significant in embodying some kind of relation between the society and state, and society. The state was acknowledging these interrelations. They were specified in the National Charter and the Constitution. To what extent they were actually followed upon is another issue, but I'm suggesting this because we're talking about authoritarianism. It's a notion of a ruler who dictates all the rules of the game, partly true, but also the game was also established in a legal document again. The government was partly responsible for its implementation, either legally, but also based on what I term moral economy. That is an unacknowledged, unwritten responsibility of the state towards citizens, and one that citizens will enforce on the state when they feel that their rights were not being protected for.
Thank you.
I have two questions, a small one and a big one. So the small one is just looking at this caricature, I mean, to me, it looks like there's a certain derogatory understanding to this representation. So I'm curious about that. And the bigger question is, in your argument about the sort of conception of the social contract and the continuity across the regimes, you refer to the neglect of the rural population and at the same time a kind of manipulation of the idea that the people includes everybody. But when you talk about the citizens that are part of the social contract, I think I hear an implicit rejection of the peasant population as part of the contract. And, you know, I think there's a kind of tension there between the idea of the nation and the people of the earth are part of the nation, and then this kind of urban focused conception of the state. That I think, well, I'm curious about how much it carries over still, and whether there's a kind of revisiting this kind of not only economic oppression, but cultural oppression. And how that would fit in reviewing or revising the social contract. It's not really a question to answer. It's more sort of something to
Well,
discuss, I guess.
yeah. Regarding the first, yeah, I think it's derogatory, but it's a caricature. So you have to bring the genre into the picture to understand what you're actually doing. So yeah, the author the caricature is partly making fun or ridiculing the image of the offended, but partly also bringing it closer to heart by making it, you know, the chubby, funny looking, ever smiling, strong and weak image. Strong and weak, the one who needs state help and state support, but also leading, you know, the Egyptian nation to independence. So this they are playing on ambivalences here. It's not, in that sense, it's not derogatory. As for the second question, if I understood correctly, I'm doing a history which is text-based. That is, I investigate principal documents of the era to extract the legal principles of the social contract. And I'm also doing political economy of the contract, that is looking at the institutional history and follow the money kind of approach to who is benefiting from what. I'm less discussing ideology here, and I'm not doing what I think should be done. And I think that what you actually refer to, that is a more sensitive sociocultural analysis of the social contract or the day-to-day practice or experience of the social contract. And there are actually very few, but good first attempts to do ethnographies of social contracts. How Egyptians experience them in school, when they face government, when they hear the president talking, and so on and so forth. This is fascinating, but this is not a thing I actually have done here. There's plenty of room. My approach is also very much city and large city oriented, as opposed to smaller provincial towns. I mean, you can do. There's plenty of more to do. I think there's nothing really. I'm hard for covering that. this topic in a way of form. But again, I appreciate your comment. It's to the point.
I will ask you.
Thank you so much. I guess the classical kind of political science way of thinking about this is, as I kind of learned it, is sort of like the Leonard Binder approach, where you have this particular class that's in many ways empowering of the leader, and then becomes a tool in many ways of whatever it is the leader wants. And so it's been a while since I kind of thought about these arguments, but my understanding of that argument is that the Arab Socialist Union, the party, was itself created as a way to kind of segment this class of people that whose political activism couldn't be tamed, and throw them into an organization that was later then liquidated or ignored or whatever. And I think what some of what you were suggesting kind of makes me wonder if that narrative is accurate. And since or maybe I don't have the narrative right, but I guess I'm wondering how we should think about the formation of the Arab Socialist Union and what its creation meant or didn't mean, in the context of thinking about to what extent this was like a real grassroots kind of pressure on the regime. And if that's not something you focus on.
No, I do consciously, although it's not part of my project, and I'll explain. When I kind of shifted earlier in my academic career, doing something completely different. I'm a generation who grew up during the cultural turn. I did cultural history of consumption, and more particularly of tobacco as production and consumption, cigarettes in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East. So at one point, in the result of the Arab, I'm sorry, this is a too long answer to your relatively short question, but the context makes it easy. 2010, 2011, I realized that I cannot do the same kind of history that I was doing in the past. It just didn't work, because we, and I say we, people in my department, I think more broadly, switched away from political history and political analysis into perhaps most interesting field, and then we entirely missed on the politics of the region. And what I've done early in my kind of retraining is actually going back to Binder, Waterbury, and others, and read them. And because much of my work is actually based on, and if you read my stuff, it's based on an earlier political science literature. The only, not the only, but a difference is that I'm still attempting to bring politics in, but bring it in a limited or fashion, or that is, or at least put it differently, to integrate it more into social analysis. To do like a sociological history or political sociology of the time. Therefore, I acknowledge the significance of what you said. It's just that I don't do this. For sure, the power relations between Nasser and broad society, but also a significant group of society was uneven. For sure, the corporatism and the establishment of one state, one party kind of thing was a significant way to concentrate power and limit politics. For that, I definitely acknowledge that. I'm still, my mandate, what I do is still talk about society and social impact, even as I said, in terms of the opposition. Because, and this is becoming more and more clear as you progress over time. I hope I'm not too anachronistic for some of the historians in the room in suggesting that what my major motivator in going back is the present. And as we go more and more into the present, 1970s and 1980s, which I focused in the past, and the 1990s, the 2000s, the middle class in Egypt and elsewhere is at the same time the main and remains the main constituency of the state, but also of the opposition, right? Of the Muslim Brotherhood, more precisely. So yeah, these are the kind of questions that I'm interested in. And therefore, I kind of limited by will with my own project.
I think we can accommodate one last question.
No, but it's long. I will talk to him. I don't want to text everyone.
You
because
gave
I-
everyone.
Yeah.
Build up and then this.
No, it's too, I just don't want to.
All right.
We're all ears.
It's why we will have a private conversation.
All right, so thank you so much, Relli, for this lovely talk, and thank you all for coming. Please sign in if you haven't, and there are plenty more box lunches. Take it, and thank you so much.
Shalom first.
Thank you, Dan. Good to see you. Bye.
Thank you.
שנה האחרונה בדקה, ואני נותן איזה נאום של זה, ועד של זה, ואז כולם רוצים כבר ללכת. I don't want to do it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Alan. Good to see you.
I mean, listening patiently for the talk.
So maybe there is the,
I will
No,
look back at it,
third.
when.
October